let's start with the basics of centering clay. So making sure that the wheel head that you're working on is nice and clean and doesn't have a lot of slippery, wet clay on it is really important. The second thing you want to do is make sure that when you put the clay down, that you really smack it down into the center where it's not moving. So making sure that your pedal, you always center more on a fast speed than a slow speed. Not full speed, but more kind of medium fast, okay? You want to be able to submerge your hands in water, and because coning is very helpful, because when I put my hands on this clay, you can see my hands are just wobbling around. We are using the palm of our hand, we're using the meat of the thumb, as well as the pinky to center this clay. Not our fingers. Our fingers just wobble around. It's really about the palm. So as I'm doing this, I'm digging my elbows either into my thighs or into my rib cage. I'm not loose. Do you see how my arms are all wobbling around? I want to avoid that. So I'm going to attach my body as much to itself as possible. And now I'm going to cone. So by coning, I'm applying pressure from the edges of the clay up into the wall. I also want to make sure that my wheel head, I call this the work area, is nice and clean. So as I start to press, you can see my body gets very, very firm as I'm starting to push this into a cone. And as I'm coning, I'm pushing inward, but my thumb is at the top of my hand, making sure that that clay stays within itself. It doesn't get pulled off. A common problem with coning or with just centering in general is that people ignore the bottom of the clay. This part of the clay gets overlooked, and it's really difficult to center this if it's in this kind of cone volcano shape. So what happens is that when we kind of press down on this, we press it all back down, and we're not applying any pressure with the bottom of the pinky. And so then all of a sudden our clay becomes these mounds of this upside down bowl shape. So the top part of my clay might start to become centered, but the bottom never gets quite centered because I can't really get underneath there. So what I think is really important into learning how to throw is, one, taking your smooth wooden rib, the pointed part, and kind of scraping an excess kind of undercut into the bottom of your piece. Do you guys see how I just did that? And then what you want to do is take your pinkies and kind of get them underneath the clay. And then the tops of my hands caress over the top, and so that the circumference of that sphere of clay is mainly in my hands. I'm getting this nice spherical shape. It's nice and mushroomed. But even still, if I have any clay that's on my wheel head here creating a bump, it's like a speed bump, I'll never be able to center it. So it's important to scrape that off, either with the side of your finger or with one of your tools. So already you can tell my clay's not quite centered yet, because when we look at my hands, do you see my hands are still moving? And if you want to know for sure if it's centered or not, just put your hands on your wheel. And if your hands don't move as it's spinning, but your hands move when it's touching the clay, you know you're not centered. So let's do coning one more time. So now that I've got this nice clean surface for my base, I've got this nice mushroom shape, I'm going to take my hands around the sides, I'm applying pressure, squeezing inward, but my thumb is arching over the top so that I'm not pulling it off, right? So I'm going to squeeze inward and up this to the point. And what's really nice about coning is coning takes all the unevenness of the clay to the top of that point. Now I can take the tops of my hands, using the meat of my thumb, I'm going to just center that little tiny nub at the top. So now this is centered. And now I'm going to bring that back down into the rest of the shape. But again, I'm not going to do that bad habit that so many beginners have where we just squish flat. I'm going to maintain that strong posture of my pinkies on my way down. So I'm going to work my way down, and as you can see, my pinky is getting underneath that clay so that I can become nice and centered. And my hands are separated because my piece of clay is pretty big for my small hands, and I'm getting nice and centered. So I know that I'm centered because when I'm touching my clay, look at my hands. They're not moving at all. Do you guys see that? See, my hands do not move. Even if I spin this really fast, my hands are not moving anymore. So that means that I'm centered and ready to go. So it's important that beginners create healthy habits of how to center your clay, avoid that mound shape, utilize the pinky underneath, and making sure that you are centered before you open is really, really